Every single year, thousands of new video games are released for the consumer to play. However, not every game is of a high quality. Many of these games will have drastic shortcomings or will never reach any significant audience. In fact, a lot of these games will be completely overlooked and never generate a real player base, regardless of the quality. Game development is tricky, it's tough, and it's frankly a miracle that a game is ever released or finished. But at the same time, with so many games released at such a rapid pace, some games can feel derivative. Some games can feel like a replica of another game. Because of the amount of games released, and because so few games ever generate a sizable audience, there is rarely attention brought to games that share an identity to a previous game. Whenever it does happen, it tends to be between large studios. Both Genshin Impact and Immortals Phoenix Rising were criticized upon reveal for initially seeming similar to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. And while it's true that these games did share some large similarities, it was clear that the games were all quite different, despite the similarities. People are quick to point out similarities in games, even from the same studio. When Kirby and the Forgotten Land was revealed, people immediately compared it to Super Mario Odyssey, and upon release, the comparison shifted to Super Mario 3D World. Game audiences tend to enjoy pointing out similarities between games, even when both games are quite different. However, oftentimes these discussions are plagued in negativity and cynicism. While comparing games to other games can help describe certain aspects of both games, those comparisons can ignore each game's unique value and identity. But because so many games do share similarities with other games, these discussions can often become critical of games for taking inspiration or being similar to another game. This is an issue. To suggest that every aspect of every game has to be completely unique for each game to have its own value. That notion ultimately undermines the concept of game design, as similarities may be shared because that's the most efficient means of design. Many combat-focused games will have similar health bars, but that does not mean that the use of a health bar is a copy from another game. Rather, the game's use of the health bar is because a health bar is an incredibly efficient way to present information to a player. I bring this up now because a few days ago, a brand new game was revealed, one which shares a very similar visual identity to a previous AAA release. The game you're seeing right now, which you may assume to be 2019's remake of Link's Awakening, is actually an upcoming 2022 release by Clear Sky Games titled Misplaced. While many games do take inspiration from other games, many are suggesting that Misplaced is not just inspired by, but is a ripoff of Link's Awakening. Many even suggest that Clear Sky Games stole assets and copied level design from Link's Awakening. Even more drastic, many are suggesting that Nintendo should sue Clear Sky Games for plagiarism. This is the final result of all the comparative criticism of video game similarities, and if we do not combat this narrative, the damage to the game design industry could be drastic. First, let us discuss the accusations against Misplaced that could actually be cause for concern. While mimicking the art style is not problematic, stealing assets, copying level design, and replicating non-open source code are all genuine issues. But in this case, there's no evidence to suggest that any of that has happened here. Sure, the art is similar, but that does not imply that the assets were stolen. In fact, there's no way that Clear Sky Games would be able to obtain the original assets from Link's Awakening. Their assets are quite similar to those found in Link's Awakening, but they are, in fact, different. The next issue to address is copied level design. Only 4 minutes of gameplay has been released for Misplaced, and while the game does have a similar grid-based system to Link's Awakening, the moments where the two games share similar block placements seems more coincidental than deliberate. When a game is designed on a grid, it's inevitable that there'll be some similar patterns and placements. That is not indicative of the game as a whole, nor does it suggest that any specific aspect of the level design has been copied from Link's Awakening. As for replicated code, there is no way to know, as the game's source code naturally has not been released. However, there is, once again, no way for Clear Sky to have access to the source code for Link's Awakening. As of now, there is nothing that could be seen as illegal or plagiarized regarding Misplaced. However, I yield that I am not affiliated with the project, meaning I can only speculate and cannot definitively say that nothing in the game is plagiarized. I can only suggest that there is no evidence or reason to believe that anything has been plagiarized. That case is very unlikely, if not downright impossible. Thus, the criticism against Misplaced seems, well, misplaced. While I don't necessarily agree with the argument, it is not unreasonable to suggest that making a game so deliberately similar to Link's Awakening is a fault in creative originality. One could justifiably argue that it is a better use of time and resources to create something more original and more unique than Misplaced. However, if we demand that indie studios cannot be derivative, that they must be the primary force of innovation in the game design industry, then, simply put, the game design industry will worsen. Clear Sky Studios is a team of two. Misplaced was developed exclusively by two people. To suggest that it is problematic of those two individuals to develop a game which has similar visual and design identity to a AAA game release is downright unfair to the developers. It's indicative of their talents that they were able to make a game that looks as good as Link's Awakening with only two people and certainly only a fraction of the budget of Link's Awakening. And as they have broken no laws, nor stolen no code, assets, or level design, there is no reason that they should be banned from displaying the results of their labor to the world as a video game. If we begin to boycott against indie games for being similar to AAA games, the industry will be far worse off as indie developers will feel less encouraged to develop games in fear that they'll be criticized just for their efforts. We have to realize that the people who are criticizing Misplaced are criticizing a team of two in order to defend a multi-billion-dollar company. As I said at the start of the video, games are difficult to make. There are so many things to consider that it's a miracle that any game ever releases at all. Especially for a team of two on a limited budget, being able to create a game, nonetheless a game that appears polished, is a miracle. It's unfair to all developers to meet games with criticism rather than praise. Every game, despite any flaws, has taken time and effort from passionate and talented developers to be created. For every video game experience, good or bad, there are developers who cared and poured in exceptional effort to make the game as good as possible, even if it didn't turn out good at all. And sure, when some games release, the reception is justifiably negative. But we can still recognize the talents behind some of the developers. But now there's a rally to suggest that Misplaced has no value in the world of video games before the game has even been released. People are upset that the game is getting attention because of its similarities to Link's Awakening. That narrative is not healthy. To suggest that indie games only have value if they are innovative and unique would suggest that inspiration is invalid. It's worth admiring when an indie game is innovative for the industry. Celeste, Grease, Shovel Knights, Undertale. It's wonderful to see innovative titles released, but that doesn't mean that every indie game must be innovative to be valid. What's wrong with just having a solid game release? It's a miracle that any game, good or bad, is released at all. It's a greater miracle when that game is good. If the expectation, not for quality, but for validity in the game design industry is not quality, but rather innovation, then we will effectively see fewer good games released. We have to consider the resources and scope that developers have before we impose rules as to what they can and cannot do. I say this not to criticize the critics. I'm not here to suggest that Misplaced is a high-quality game, as it hasn't even been released yet. I say this to defend the validity of all games, regardless of the size of the studio or the level of inspiration or innovation. Not every game will release and be a masterpiece. In fact, not every game will release and be objectively good. And if we want to be honest, not every game will be released at all. But ultimately, if developers want to take the time and effort to develop a game, regardless of how innovative it is, that game is valuable. If we can have more good games released for more talented developers, then everybody who plays games is better off for it, even if you don't play every game. Plus, game developers can improve. Making a great game is a great learning experience to develop more games in the future. So if we gatekeep what games are valid and what games are not, we limit the amount of good games that will be made.